All right, so today we're going to be talking about ancient China and the Silk Road. Now, for our entire class so far, we've pretty much been focusing on ancient history in the Fertile Crescent and the areas around it, like Northern Africa with Egypt, and then Southeastern Europe with Greece. Now we're going to venture into the eastern part of the world, into China, and figure out what was going on in China during this entire time that we've been talking about in this class. So probably a lot of different things come to mind when you think of China. Maybe the dragon, maybe the Great Wall. They've had the Olympics there before. So a lot of things come to our mind when we think about China. Now, something that's really special about China is that it's the oldest surviving civilization in the world. Okay, and by that I mean it's the oldest continuously existing civilization. Yes, there were civilizations before China, but they are either not around today anymore, like Mesopotamia, or they had an intermediary period where they didn't exist, like Egypt. So China is not the oldest civilization in the world, period, but it's the oldest civilization in the world that's still around today. Its written history goes back more than 3,500 years, 1,500 years before the birth of Christ. So in addition to China's longevity, just how long it has lasted, something else that's significant about ancient China is its consistency. China's culture did not really change all that much to a large extent until the 20th century. Now, just to think about how significant that is, for over 3,000 years, for your culture to not really change all that much, that's very unusual. That's a very special thing about ancient China. If you just think about how much American culture has changed in the past 20 years. It's staggering to think that China did not really change all that much for several thousand years. So its consistency and its longevity make China kind of stand out from other ancient civilizations. China still had their line of ancient dynasties in power until 1911 AD, as in only 107 years ago. So not that long ago, really. They still had their ancient dynasties, that dynastic succession, kind of like a monarchy that we've learned about in other cultures. And Chinese culture was very similar to that of ancient China up until that point. They still had the same type of customs, largely the same religion, wore the same type of clothing, up until that point, up until 1911, when they had a revolution and a lot started to change. Okay, so China today is very different from ancient China, but up until 1911, it was actually very similar. Now, the governing system in ancient China, as I've already said, was the dynastic system. So you probably heard the term dynasty before. It's kind of like a ruling family. So dynasties are ruled by emperors that came from the same ruling family. So you'd have an heir, maybe your son would take over after you die. So it was not a democracy by any means. Okay, the Greeks were the only ones who had experimented with democracy up to this point. This was essentially a monarchy. So these dynasties were ruling families. Now, dynasties would sometimes be taken over and replaced by other families that would then create their own dynasty. So that's why the history of ancient China isn't just one dynasty ruling for 3,000 years. It's a series of about a dozen different major dynasties, because sometimes dynasties would be taken over by other families, and then other times they would simply not have an heir, and so another dynasty would step up into power. Now, most emperors were male, not all, but most emperors were male. Just like most pharaohs in Egypt were male, except for people like Hatshepsut and Cleopatra. And the goal of each dynasty was political stability. They did not want any sort of revolution, any sort of revolt, any sort of upheaval in their country during their rule. Political stability was always the goal for the dynasties. So here's just a list of the dynasties of ancient China. I'm going to give you the dates that they were all around from, but remember, on my tests, you're not going to have to memorize dates or anything, but it's a good idea to kind of have these dates in your notes. That way you can kind of get a time frame about when I'm talking about here. So the first Chinese dynasty was called the Xia Dynasty, Xia, the Xia Dynasty. Now, what's really interesting about the Xia Dynasty is that they go back all the way to about 2000 BC, but some historians actually think that this might have been a fictional dynasty. A lot of what we read about in ancient history, some people are starting to say might have been partially fictional. For example, in ancient Greece, the Trojan Wars are mostly fictional. The story of the Trojan horse might not be completely accurate. Okay, that's part of a story. So a lot of historians believe that the Xia dynasty was fictional because there's no archaeological evidence for it. They didn't leave behind any artifacts, and they did not have written language at that time. Remember, the written language in China did not start until about 1500 BC. So the Xia dynasty might have been fictional, started by the next dynasty that came along, but then again, it might have existed anyway. So the second dynasty was the Shang Dynasty. They're very important because they were the first dynasty to leave behind artifacts. Also the first dynasty to leave behind any sort of written documents. All right, so that's where we can start studying ancient Chinese history with certainty. Okay, we learned this with ancient Mesopotamia. Once writing begins, that's when we become enlightened about history and can actually start learning things with certainty. So the Shang Dynasty was very important for that reason. 100% sure that they were real, all right, and every other dynasty we know for a fact did exist. The Xia is the only one we're not so certain about. After the Shang Dynasty came the Zhou Dynasty, and they were significant because they were Mongols. Okay, now the Mongols had an empire during the Middle Ages, which we're going to talk about in Unit 2, but at this time they were in China. Now the Warring States period was a period from 475 BC to 221 BC. This is a time of political chaos, no real dynasty in power at the time, and this was the time when a guy named Confucius existed, and we'll learn about him a little while later. After that came the Qin Dynasty, which you get the name China from. Then came the Han Dynasty. They existed around the time of Jesus. Then came the Sui Dynasty, followed by the Tang, the Song, and the Yuan. I'm going to correct myself, actually. The Yuan were the Mongols, not the Zhou. Okay, sorry about that. I spoke mistakenly there. The Yuan dynasty were the Mongols. Okay, so they were the ones who had the empire in the Middle Ages that we will be talking about. That was the Yuan dynasty. So that's going all the way up to the 1300s AD. We have not gotten there yet in class. I'm just giving you kind of an overview of ancient Chinese history. But the Yuan dynasty were the Mongols, and then after the Yuan came the Ming dynasty. Now they were really important because they were the ones who built the bulk of the Great Wall of China, and they did this in order to keep the Mongols out of China. Okay, the Mongols were known for being barbarians, and the wall was built in part to keep the Mongols out. Now there are actually several Great Walls of China, as you can kind of see in that picture. It's not all connected there, but the bulk of it and what we think of today as the Great Wall, what's near Beijing, that was built by the Ming dynasty. Then came the Qing Dynasty. Okay, now this was the last dynasty of ancient China. It ruled from 1644 all the way until 1911, when it was replaced by a modern government after the revolution of 1911. So again, you're not going to have to know these dates specifically, but you will need to know some things about a lot of these different dynasties. Right? So that's just a little overview of ancient China before we get into the specifics. Now, one famous ancient Chinese philosopher lived during the Warring States period, which we already talked about. Now, we've talked about philosophers before. Remember Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Okay, those were all philosophers from ancient Greece, very important people. And then you had a very famous Chinese philosopher named Confucius. There's even a religion today called Confucianism that's based off of his teachings. Now, he believed that in order to produce a peaceful, smoothly run society, you had to embrace hierarchy and morally upright behavior. So hierarchy basically means that one person is above another, who's above another, but then they're below another person, okay? So that kind of social structure. So for example, in the family system, the hierarchy traditionally would be the father at the top, then the mother, and then the children, okay? And the children in hierarchy of oldest to youngest. All right, so that's something that Confucius very much believed in. He was very traditional in that way. And he said morally upright behavior is the only way to have a smoothly run society if you have good people in that society. So, one thing he really emphasized was children serving and submitting to their parents. Now, his philosophy has been followed through Chinese history all the way to the present day. And as I said, there's even a religion called Confucianism that's completely devoted to his teachings. He's seen as a very wise teacher. Whether or not you agree with all he said, his philosophy on morally upright behavior and things like that, it's kind of hard to deny that that's pretty wise. So Confucius was a very famous and important philosopher during Chinese history. So there are a lot of major inventions and developments during Chinese history, specifically during the Han Dynasty. So this is what you need to know about the Han Dynasty. Around 100 BC, around the time of Julius Caesar, who we'll be learning about later, the Chinese invented paper. All right, one of the most important inventions of all time. All right, we do our bell work every single day on paper. These days, I guess you could say paper is a little bit less important than it used to be 20 years ago before all this technology, but it's still very, very important. Okay, paper is huge, and the Chinese invented it. Before the Chinese, you had people like the Egyptians writing on papyrus, which was basically reeds that grew along the Nile River. But now with paper from trees, you have a much more reliable and much better form of what to write on. Okay, here's one of the oldest written documents we have from ancient China. Okay, this is one of the first uses of paper that we know of. Okay, this is actually paper from trees similar to what we use today. They also invented the kite, and they invented silk. Okay, now silk was really, really important because it became really popular in Europe. So the Silk Road began during the Han Dynasty, and we'll get into what the Silk Road was in a few minutes here. There were also a lot of major inventions and developments during the Tang Dynasty. So the Han and the Tang, whenever you think of Chinese inventions, those are the two dynasties you need to think of, the Han and the Tang. So in the 600s AD, a group of Chinese alchemists, who were basically fake chemists who were trying to make everything into gold, they tried to create an elixir for immortality, which means trying to live forever. They were wanting to live forever, and so they tried to make an elixir for immortality. Of course, they failed at this because, they're dead now. But they inadvertently, in this process of trying to create an elixir for immortality, they created gunpowder. Okay? Now, this changed world history forever. Just imagine a world without gunpowder. It completely revolutionized how wars were fought. Without gunpowder, we probably wouldn't have developed any of the modern weapons that we have now. We'd probably still be fighting with swords and shields. So this really changed world history forever, this beginning of and invention of or discovery of gunpowder. The Chinese during the Tang Dynasty also invented the toothbrush. I know that kind of looks like a broom up there, but that's an ancient Chinese toothbrush. And of course, they invented one of our favorite things on the 4th of July, fireworks. Since they invented gunpowder, they thought they'd have some fun with it and invent fireworks as well. So if you have a vision in your mind of Chinese New Year with the dragon and the fireworks, that's a pretty accurate image. So the ancient Chinese were very important to the field of history as well. They're very important to our purposes because they were one of the first civilizations to ever see the real value in studying history. They said, hey, it's important to learn from the past so we don't repeat the mistakes. It's important to learn from the past so we know what our ancestors did, and so we can either copy them if they were good people or try to do the opposite of what they did if they were bad people. So they strongly believed in learning from the past, and Chinese children were taught the wisdom of the, quote, sage emperors. A sage is basically like a wise man. That's what that word means. And that is what Chinese children were taught in schools and in the home. They were taught the wisdom of people of the past. So emperors in power always looked to previous emperors' actions and teachings for guidance, okay, to guide their decisions and actions. All right, they were always looking in their history scrolls written on paper, since they invented that, and they were saying, okay, what did previous emperors do? What worked for them? What didn't work for them? And they really learned from history. So they really saw the value in studying history and were wise in that way. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Silk Road. Okay, what was the Silk Road? When was it in use? what are we talking about here? Why was it so important? Well, the Silk Road was an overland route. Okay, part of it was overland, and as part of it, you see, was in the ocean, okay, as you see on that map there. And it was comprised of two main routes. One of them connected the Mediterranean, which is the Mediterranean Sea. You see that on the left side of the map between Europe and Egypt. Okay, so locate that on the map there. It connected the Mediterranean, and in turn Europe, to Central Asia. Okay, so look around where Persia is. Okay, we know about Persia. It connected Europe to Central Asia. And then the other route connected Central Asia to China. As you see China on the map on the far right side, hopefully we can locate China right there. Okay, now part of the routes were maritime routes, which means in the water. Okay, you had ships, and it was essentially used for trade. Okay, so a network of water routes that added to the road, and then an overland route that went through the mountains and the deserts of Asia to get basically from Europe to China. It was in use from 120 BC, so before the birth of Christ, all the way until 1450 AD. So about 1600 years, this Silk Road was in use. Okay, what was the purpose of it? Well, as I said, it was trade. Trade, we've learned about, was invented by the Mesopotamians, and it's really important because you can get things that you don't grow naturally or can't produce yourselves. Maybe have more variety in your diet or in the clothes you wear and things like that. It also connects people and makes people more friendly. So trade, it's something we still do today in 2018, and trade was really important to the ancient people as well. So the Silk Road radically expanded trade and changed the world in that way. Before the Silk Road, yes, trade did exist, but you pretty much didn't trade with people more than a couple hundred miles away. If you were in Egypt, yeah, maybe you traded with people in Canaan, maybe in Babylon, but that was about as far as it went. Here, you can travel thousands of miles and trade with people you would never come into contact with otherwise. So this led to kind of globalization. It really connected the world through trade. Now, one of the main items traded along the Silk Road, of course, as you can guess, was silk. And silk was in really high demand. It came from China. The ancient Chinese held the secret as to how they created silk. It was from silkworms. But at the time, nobody knew how they created silk, and everyone wanted it. It's pretty, it's shiny, it feels good, it's rare. It's kind of a sign of royalty in Europe. But the Chinese kept their secret of silk production and that process. That way, they maintained control of the supply. And if you can maintain control of supply, if you're the only people who sell silk, you can name your price. You don't have to compete with other people who can make silk. So the Chinese were very careful about protecting the secret about how they made silk. They wanted to be the only ones who made it. That way they could sell it for really high prices, since that was the only place to get it. Since it was so rare and exotic, silk became kind of a status symbol, especially in Europe. If you were seen wearing silk, people said, hey, that person is rich, they're wealthy, they have it going on, all right? Also, practically speaking, silk is very cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Okay, so it's something you could wear year-round, and it kept you comfortable, in addition to making you look both good or pretty and rich. So China became extremely wealthy through the silk trade. If it weren't for the Silk Road, China would not have been such a major power, but they became very wealthy through trade through the Silk Road. They also exported iron and silver, but silk was their major cash crop, so to speak. China, of course, was not the only exporter that used the Silk Road. When we talk about trade, we talk about imports and exports. All right, imports are what you bring into your country. That means you're an importer. An export is what you bring out of your country to other people. Okay, that's called being an exporter. So China was not the only exporter that used the Silk Road. Several other goods were traded from other countries. So you had the Mediterranean countries, places like Egypt and Canaan and Greece and Rome, and those countries exported things that grow naturally around the Mediterranean. Okay, you have olives, olive oil, grapes, wine, right? All sorts of things that grow naturally in the Mediterranean was able to be shipped all the way to China. Then you had India, that was kind of in the middle of the Silk Road in southern Asia, and they exported cotton and other textiles. They were really good at making clothing, not silk. They didn't know the secret to making silk, but they still knew how to make cotton and other textiles and were really good at that and were able to export those things. And then also Arabia, okay, modern day like Saudi Arabia, Middle East, that area, they exported incense and spices, right? At this time, they didn't have many spices. I mean, imagine eating eating lunch or eating any meal with no spices whatsoever, no salt, no pepper. That's pretty much what the European diet was before the Silk Road. But then came all these spices from Arabia and it made food taste great. And so it was in really high demand. People wanted these spices from Arabia. So the Silk Road was really good for the global economy and kind of connected the world in that way. Now, the people who ran the operations along the land routes of the Silk Road were mostly nomads of Central Asia. And that's because they knew the terrain. They knew how to get from point A to point B in Central Asia, which is a really tough area to traverse. It's a really difficult area to travel over because it's mostly desert, right? So there's not much water. Then you have a lot of rocks and mountains that are difficult to climb over, all right? So they knew the terrain. They had the equipment, okay? They knew that area very, very well. And they also had the animals that were necessary to transport goods across the continent, okay? Namely camels. Camels were huge along the Silk Road. Camels can go a very long time without water. And then whenever they do get to an oasis to get some water, they can drink up to 200 liters of water. That's a huge amount. I think of a 2-liter bottle like of Coke, okay, and imagine 100 of those filled with water. That's how much a camel can drink at once. All right, so they can go a really long time without water, and they were also really good because of their wide hooves at walking across the sand. Okay, so the nomads of Central Asia knew how to transport goods across the continent and did a really good job. So nomads, okay, people who don't really have one set home but just travel from place to place looking for food and foraging, nomads for the first time became really influential to world history. I'm not saying they weren't important before. Everyone's important, everybody matters, but this is the first time they became influential to world history and actually started influencing other people beyond their tribe. And that's because of how they connected the world. Without the nomads of Central Asia, there would be a gap in the Silk Road, and we wouldn't be able to have exported the silk and the spices and the cotton and the textiles and the grapes and the wine and the olives and olive oil and everything that was traded along the Silk Road. So the merchants, as you can imagine, became very wealthy. If you have a skill that not many people have, you can make a lot of money doing that skill. So the merchants became very wealthy. Now, the Silk Road is one of the earliest examples of globalization. That basically means the world kind of getting smaller symbolically, more connected. Globalization is something we really have today. I mean, you can be in contact with someone on the other side of the world in seconds with FaceTime. All right, that's an extreme example of globalization. But this is one of the earliest examples of globalization. Of course, you couldn't communicate that quickly, but it was now possible to actually communicate with people and actually get stuff from thousands of miles away. Now, in addition to the products, to the actual stuff that was traded along the Silk Road, a couple other things were traded as well. First of all, ideas. Ideas were traded along the Silk Road. Now, before the Silk Road, pretty much if you lived in one civilization, you agreed with the ideas of that civilization because you didn't really know any other ideas. So Christianity and Western philosophy kind of made their way east along the Silk Road to places like India and China. They started to learn about this guy named Jesus Christ who supposedly died on a cross and rose from the dead and things like that. So these ideas and the Western philosophy as well from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Chinese started to learn about that. And then on the other hand, Buddhism, which is a Chinese religion, an Eastern religion, and the whole concept of nirvana, which is also an Eastern concept about the afterlife, those ideas made their way to the West. Right? So people in Europe started to learn about Buddhism in the same way that people in China started to learn about Christianity. So ideas were traded, so to speak, along the Silk Road. These ideas were not always accepted, of course, okay, but you could still learn about something without accepting it. We do that all the time in world history class. However, even though these ideas weren't always accepted, they gained more widespread exposure and people became more cultured. That's what it means to be cultured, to know about other cultures, about other ideas, even if you don't necessarily agree with them. And then finally, the most negative result of trade along the Silk Road. Okay, you always have positive and negative results of pretty much everything in history. All right, but one of the most negative results of trade along the Silk Road was that diseases were spread along it. Okay, you had the nomads getting diseases from China or India or Central Asia and then bringing them back to Europe. And then you had them getting diseases in Europe and bringing them back to China. So a lot of diseases were spread along it. In particular, two devastating diseases made their way across the world, smallpox and measles. Smallpox and measles. Now, these days, if you get smallpox or measles, I mean, that's very, very rare, but it's pretty much curable. But these diseases weren't treatable really at the time, and they didn't remain in Europe either. Okay, whenever they made their way to Europe from Asia, what were Europeans doing around that time? They were exploring. Okay, they were exploring the New World, North and South America. So a lot of European explorers spread these sicknesses that they got from the Silk Road to a lot of Native Americans, and inadvertently wiped out a lot of Native Americans. Okay, so millions of people died as a result of diseases that were spread along the Silk Road. So that's certainly not a positive thing. And most notably, the Black Death. Okay, you probably heard of the plague. Okay, the second outbreak of the bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, that was spread along the Silk Road. It was spread from rats that came on trade ships from the Black Sea, which is kind of on the border of Asia and Europe. And this disease killed off 1/3 of the world's population, and it probably wouldn't have happened without the Silk Road. So these are the tough questions of history we have to wrestle with. Was the Silk Road, in the end, a positive thing or a negative thing? Well, it was kind of both. It had a lot of really positive impacts, but also, as you see with the diseases, it had a lot of negative impacts. And a lot of things in history are like that. You remember when I talked about unifying Greece. Okay, whenever Philip II of Macedon unified Greece as one country, that was really positive because it stopped the fighting in Greece and it made them more powerful. But it was also negative because it squashed democracy and kind of killed it and kind of put it on the back burner for 2,000 years. So everything, including the Silk Road in history, or I should say most things in history, have both positive and negative consequences. All right, so that is our study of ancient China and the Silk Road. Of course, let me know if you have any questions or if I can better explain anything that I just explained.